The air was thick with tension. Anyone who walked into the White House press room that afternoon could feel it. Something was different. This wasn't going to be just another routine press briefing. This was going to be a moment that would echo through the media landscape for months to come. Kaitlan Collins adjusted her blazer, her fingers subtly trembling as she arranged her notes. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks. CNN had positioned her here for a reason. She was their weapon, their last hope to land a knockout punch against the administration that had consistently defied their narrative. For months, the network had been struggling. Ratings were plummeting. Credibility was in free fall. And now, everything hinged on this single press conference. Collins knew she couldn't afford to miss. This was her moment to prove that CNN still mattered, that they could still control the narrative. But what Collins didn't know, what she couldn't possibly anticipate, was that she was walking into a carefully laid trap. The previous administration's press conferences had been predictable. Journalists would lob their carefully crafted questions, hoping to catch a slip, to create a soundbite that would dominate the news cycle. The press secretaries would dance around the issues, offering rehearsed responses designed to say nothing while appearing to say everything. This was different. Before we get back to what happened, if you're someone who appreciates what Karoline Leavitt has to offer, then make sure to hit the subscribe button because we will continue to bring you more such news. Now, let's get back. The new administration's press secretary had studied CNN's tactics. They understood the media's playbook better than the media understood itself. And today, they were going to expose everything. As Collins scanned the room, she saw the familiar faces of Washington's media elite. Veteran reporters who had seen it all, younger journalists hungry for their big break, camera operators positioning themselves for the perfect shot. Each of them sensed something was different, but none could predict what was about to unfold. In the digital age, a press conference was no longer just about what happened in the room. It was about the immediate reaction, the viral moments, the hashtags that would define the narrative within minutes of the exchange. CNN had mastered this game for years, carefully selecting clips, crafting headlines, shaping public perception. But today, the rules were about to change. Collins represented everything the network had become: aggressive, partisan, more interested in creating a narrative than reporting facts. She had built her reputation on confrontational interviews, on asking questions designed to provoke rather than inform. Her colleagues celebrated her as a fearless journalist. Her critics saw her as a political operative, masquerading as a reporter. What made Collins dangerous wasn't just her ambition. It was her absolute conviction that she was right. She believed, truly believed, that her questions would expose the administration's weaknesses. She thought she was walking into a moment of journalistic triumph. She had no idea she was about to become the story. The room buzzed with a nervous energy. Reporters checked their smartphones. Camera operators adjusted their equipment. In the back, social media influencers and digital journalists were already preparing their live commentary platforms, waiting to dissect every word. Little did they know this press conference would become more than just a news event. It would be a turning point. As the press secretary approached the podium, Collins took a deep breath. She had her first question ready, a carefully crafted missile designed to pierce the administration's defenses. She was confident. She was prepared. She was completely wrong. What was about to happen would not just be a confrontation. It would be a complete destruction of everything CNN thought they knew about controlling the narrative. And the entire world was about to watch it unfold, live and unfiltered. Get ready. Because this was going to be a press conference that would be talked about for years to come. The moment arrived with surgical precision. Collins leaned forward, her first question loaded like a weapon, designed to pierce the administration's carefully constructed defense. "Let's talk about the recent executive actions," she began, her voice carrying that distinctive CNN tone, part accusation, part challenge. Multiple legal experts are arguing that the administration's recent moves regarding federal funding and executive authority are potentially unconstitutional. How do you respond to concerns that these actions are overstepping legal boundaries? Spot C. It was a classic media trap, designed to put the press secretary on the defensive, to create a moment of hesitation that could be spun into a headline. Collins knew it. Her producers knew it. This was the kind of gotcha moment that could define a news cycle. But the press secretary was ready. Completely, utterly ready. "I appreciate the question," came the response, calm, measured, but with an underlying steel that made several reporters shift in their seats. "Let's be very clear about the legal framework we're operating under." What followed was a masterclass in legal dismantling that would be studied in journalism schools for years to come. The press secretary began to systematically deconstruct the legal challenge, citing specific precedents, referencing exact passages from Office of Management and budget memos, and quoting Supreme Court decisions with a precision that made Collins's carefully prepared question look like an amateur's attempt. "The White House counsel's office has extensively reviewed these actions," the press secretary continued, "and we are confident that they are not only within the letter of the law, but also within its spirit. Specifically, the memo dated, specific date, clearly outlines the legal basis for our actions." Collins tried to interject, but the momentum was already lost. Each attempt to challenge the response was met with a more detailed, more devastating legal explanation. The room could feel it happening. This wasn't just a press conference. This was a surgical strike. Within minutes, social media began to explode. Hashtags like #LegalTakedown and #CNNExposed started trending. Lawyers and legal experts who were live tweeting the conference began sharing screenshots of the specific legal references, adding credibility to every word. Collins was losing control, and everyone could see it. Her follow-up questions became increasingly desperate. Each one was met with a calm, precise deconstruction that made her initial confrontation look like a poorly prepared law school mock trial. "Are you saying," Collins pressed, her voice slightly higher than before, "that the administration believes it has unlimited authority to interpret funding appropriations?" "Oh, you know what?" The press secretary's response was devastating in its simplicity. "I'm saying we have a clear legal basis, supported by precedent, that has been thoroughly reviewed by legal experts. If you're questioning the specificity of our authority, I'd be happy to provide you with the exact legal citations." It was a checkmate moment. The digital world was already ablaze. Screenshots of the exchange were being shared across platforms. Conservative commentators were celebrating. Even some legal experts who weren't politically aligned were grudgingly impressed by the comprehensive legal breakdown. Collins had walked in believing she would expose legal vulnerabilities. Instead, she had provided a platform for the administration to showcase its legal preparedness. The first exchange was over, and it was clear who had won, but this was just the beginning. The silence that followed was electric. Collins knew she was losing ground, but she wasn't prepared to concede defeat. This was CNN's moment, and she was determined to extract something, anything, that could be spun into a narrative. "Let's be specific," she pressed, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "The administration has taken unprecedented steps in interpreting executive authority. Multiple constitutional scholars are arguing that these actions represent a dangerous expansion of presidential power." It was her last-ditch attempt to regain control of the narrative, but the press secretary was already 3 moves ahead. "I'm glad you brought up constitutional scholars," came the response, cool, calculated, with an underlying tone that suggested Collins had just walked into a carefully laid trap. "Because I'd be happy to discuss the actual legal precedents that directly support our position." What followed was a masterclass in legal deconstruction that would be analyzed in law schools and political science departments for years to come. The press secretary began to methodically break down the legal argument, citing not just recent precedents, but diving deep into historical interpretations of executive authority. Each reference was precise, each citation meticulously researched. It wasn't just a defense, it was a comprehensive demolition of the proposed constitutional challenge. "Let's talk about the Supreme Court case of Customs Bureau versus executive authority," the press secretary said, pulling out a thick folder of documents, specifically the ruling that directly addresses the scope of presidential interpretation of appropriated funds. Reporters in the room began to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way CNN had planned. This was turning into a legal seminar that was systematically dismantling every potential criticism. The digital world was already exploding. Legal experts were live tweeting the exchange, pulling up case law, verifying each reference in real time. The hashtag #LegalTakedown was trending worldwide, with conservatives celebrating and even some liberal legal commentators begrudgingly acknowledging the comprehensive legal argument. Collins tried another approach. But aren't you concerned about the potential challenges this interpretation could face in court? The press secretary's response was devastating in its precision. We are not just prepared for potential challenges. We have meticulously constructed our legal strategy, anticipating them. Each action has been reviewed by multiple legal experts, including former Supreme Court clerks and constitutional law professors from across the political spectrum, etc. It was a surgical strike. Collins had walked in believing she would expose legal vulnerabilities. Instead, she had provided a platform for the administration to showcase its legal preparedness. But this was far from over. The press secretary continued, pulling out additional documents. Let me be absolutely clear. The Office of Management and Budget Memo, dated specific date, provides explicit guidance on the interpretation of funding appropriations. This isn't a novel interpretation. This is a well-established legal principle that has been upheld multiple times. What was happening transcended a typical press conference. This was a public legal education, a dismantling of media narrative in real time. Social media was in complete meltdown. Conservative commentators were celebrating what they saw as a complete destruction of CNN's narrative. Legal experts were sharing screenshots, breaking down the technical legal arguments. Even platforms typically critical of the administration were forced to acknowledge the comprehensive nature of the response. Collins realized she was losing control of not just the narrative, but the entire conversation. Her carefully prepared questions were being systematically deconstructed, her legal challenges exposed as superficial talking points. "Are you saying," she pressed, her voice now betraying a hint of desperation, "that the administration believes it has unlimited authority to interpret these appropriations?" The press secretary's response was a masterpiece of legal precision. "I'm saying we have a clear, legally substantiated basis for our actions, supported by precedent, thoroughly reviewed by experts. If you're questioning the specificity of our authority, I'm more than prepared to provide you with the exact legal citations and historical context." It was a checkmate moment. The digital landscape was transforming in real time. What CNN had hoped would be a moment of exposure had become a comprehensive legal education. Hashtags like #CNNLegalFail and #AdministrationTakedown were spreading like wildfire. Collins had walked into the press conference believing she would expose legal vulnerabilities. Instead, she had provided a platform for the administration to showcase its extraordinary legal preparedness. The first exchange was over, and it was devastatingly clear who had won. But this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most memorable press conferences in modern political history. Realizing she had been thoroughly defeated on legal grounds, Collins pivoted. It was a classic media strategy. When one line of attack fails, shift to another. And economic criticism was always a reliable weapon. "Let's talk about the economic reality Americans are facing," she began, her voice taking on a performative concern. "Inflation continues to impact families. Egg prices, grocery costs, gas prices. Americans are struggling. How does this administration respond to the economic pain?" It was supposed to be her gotcha moment, a question designed to put the administration on the defensive, to create a soundbite that would dominate the news cycle. She had no idea what was coming. The press secretary leaned forward, a slight smile playing at the corner of the mouth. This wasn't going to be a defensive response. This was going to be a comprehensive demolition of the entire media narrative. "I'm glad you brought up economic realities," came the response, "because let's have an honest conversation about what's actually happening to American families." What followed was a masterclass in economic communication that would be studied in political science departments for years to come. The press secretary began to methodically break down the economic landscape, not with dry statistics, but with a narrative that connected directly to American kitchen table experiences. Each point was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at the heart of the media's selective reporting. "Let's talk about egg prices," the press secretary said, pulling out a detailed chart. "In 2024, under the previous administration, egg prices increased by 65%. 65%. And yet, where was CNN's outrage then?" The room went silent. Reporters shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the narrative they had prepared for. "But it wasn't just eggs," the press secretary continued. "The cost of groceries, gasoline, rent, everything skyrocketed under the previous administration. And what did CNN do? They ran cover. They manufactured excuses. They protected their preferred political narrative." Social media was already exploding. The hashtag #HashEconomicsTruth began trending within minutes. Fact-checkers were scrambling to verify the numbers. Conservative commentators were sharing screenshots, breaking down the economic data in real time. Collins tried to interject, but the momentum was unstoppable. "Let me be crystal clear," the press secretary said. "The Biden administration didn't just inherit an economic mess. They inherited an economic catastrophe. Trillions of dollars printed. American energy production strangled. Small businesses decimated. And yet, we're supposed to believe that CNN cares about economic pain?" The digital landscape was transforming. What was meant to be a moment of economic criticism had become a comprehensive takedown of media manipulation. "Let's talk about the real reason behind the egg shortage," the press secretary continued. "The previous administration's Department of Agriculture ordered the mass killing of over 100 million chickens. 100 million. That's not a typo. That's not speculation. That's a fact." Reporters exchanged glances. This was not the press conference they had expected. "You cut down the supply, prices go up," the press secretary said. "It's basic economics. And yet, somehow, we're supposed to pretend this was unavoidable? That it just happened by accident? No. This was a direct policy decision." Collins was losing control. Her carefully prepared economic criticism was being systematically dismantled. "Why do Americans continue to struggle?" the press secretary asked rhetorically. "Because you don't print trillions of dollars, shut down American energy production, and drive businesses into the ground for 4 straight years, and then expect things to magically fix themselves." The hashtags were multiplying. #EconomicTruth, #MediaExposed, CNN fail were trending worldwide. Conservative media was breaking down the exchange in real time. Even some moderate voices were admitting this was a comprehensive takedown. "This administration is taking concrete steps," the press secretary continued. "We're pushing for energy independence. We're cutting unnecessary regulations. We're nominating leaders who actually understand how to fix the economic mess we inherited." Collins tried one last desperate pivot. "But prices are still high. Americans are still struggling." The response was devastating in its simplicity. "Of course they are. You don't undo 4 years of economic destruction overnight. But for the first time in years, Americans are seeing real, tangible steps toward recovery." The digital world was on fire. Clips of the exchange were spreading across platforms. TikTok was flooded with breakdowns. YouTube channels were analyzing every moment. Collins had walked in believing she would expose economic vulnerabilities. Instead, she had provided a platform for a comprehensive dismantling of the media's economic narrative. The economic segment was over, and it was devastatingly clear who had won. But this was just the beginning of what would become the most memorable press conference in modern political history. The room tensed. Collins knew this was her last chance, her final opportunity to land a decisive blow against the administration. Her gotcha question was carefully crafted, designed to be the ultimate trap. Let's discuss the recent comments about political persecution, she began, her voice laden with practiced righteousness. Critics argue that recent statements are undermining the legitimacy of ongoing investigations and potentially weaponizing political discourse. It was a question constructed to corner, to create a headline, to force an admission, a slip, anything that could be twisted into a narrative of political vindictiveness. She had no idea she was walking into a complete annihilation. The press secretary's response would become a moment studied in political communication for years to come. This wasn't going to be a defensive explanation. This was going to be a comprehensive surgical strike against the entire media narrative. Political persecution, the press secretary repeated, each word measured, deliberate. Let's have an honest conversation about what political persecution actually looks like. What followed was a devastating deconstruction that would shake the foundations of mainstream media reporting. For years, the press secretary began, Democrats and media outlets like CNN have painted a narrative of President Trump as a threat to democracy, not a political opponent, not someone with different policy approaches, but an actual threat to be eliminated. The room went silent. Reporters shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a typical press conference response. This was a full-scale indictment. Let's talk about what actually happened, the press secretary continued. Multiple investigations were launched not because of actual crimes, but because the political establishment wanted to stop one man. The Russia investigation, a complete hoax, 2 impeachments based on baseless charges, and when those failed, they moved to even more extreme measures. Social media was exploding. The hashtag #political_persecution was trending within seconds. Conservative commentators were sharing screenshots. Fact-checkers were working overtime. The Biden Justice Department actively targeted President Trump, the press secretary said, voice unwavering. He was dragged into courtrooms for weeks, preventing him from campaigning effectively. And what was the goal? It wasn't about justice. It was about stopping him from winning. Collins tried to interject, but the momentum was unstoppable. Let's be very clear about the consequences of this rhetoric, the press secretary continued. We've seen 2 assassination attempts on President Trump. 2, and what do both of those attackers have in common? They were radicalized by the exact talking points that CNN and other outlets have been pushing for years. The digital landscape was transforming. What was meant to be a moment of criticism had become a comprehensive takedown of media manipulation. When you constantly tell people that a president is a threat to democracy, the press secretary said, when you compare him to dictators, when you tell people the only way to save the country is to stop him, there are unstable individuals who will take that literally. Reporters exchanged nervous glances. This was not the press conference they had expected. Remember the baseball field shooting? The press secretary asked. A radicalized individual targeted Republican lawmakers, believing they were destroying the country. And why? Because of the exact narrative pushed by networks like CNN. Collins was losing control. Her carefully prepared questions were being systematically dismantled. You want to talk about political persecution? The press secretary continued. Let's talk about the prosecutors who ran campaign ads bragging about indicting Trump. Let's talk about leftist donors pouring millions into electing district attorneys whose sole mission was to go after one man. The hashtags were multiplying. #media manipulation #political witch hunt #truth exposed were trending worldwide. Conservative media was breaking down the exchange in real time. How about the fact that Trump sat in a courtroom for 7 weeks while his opponent campaigned freely? The press secretary asked. How about the fact that the same people claiming to care about democracy were actively trying to remove the leading Republican candidate from the ballot? Well, Collins tried one last desperate pivot. But aren't these legitimate legal proceedings? The response was devastating in its simplicity. These are not legal proceedings. This is political persecution, plain and simple. The digital world was on fire. Clips of the exchange were spreading across platforms. TikTok was flooded with breakdowns. YouTube channels were analyzing every moment. Collins had walked in believing she would expose political manipulation. Instead, she had provided a platform for a comprehensive dismantling of the media's persecution narrative. The political persecution segment was over, and it was devastatingly clear who had won. But this was just the beginning of what would become the most memorable press conference in modern political history. This was the moment everything had been building towards, the final devastating blow that would not just dismantle Collins, but expose the entire media ecosystem. The press secretary leaned forward, a look of calculated precision in their eyes. This wasn't just going to be a response. This was going to be a complete dismantling of media credibility. "Let's talk about trust," the press secretary began. "Let's talk about why the American people have completely lost faith in outlets like CNN." The room went dead silent. This was no longer just a press conference. This was an execution. "You don't just push false narratives," the press secretary continued. "You actively contribute to real-world division. You don't just spin the truth, you manufacture it." Social media was already catching fire. Hashtags like #MediaTakedown and #CNNExposed were trending within seconds. Conservative commentators were preparing their breakdown videos. Digital platforms were lighting up with anticipation. For years, CNN has positioned itself as a neutral arbiter of truth, the press secretary said, each word carefully chosen. But the reality is far different. You are not journalists. You are political activists operating under the guise of news reporting. Collins tried to interject, but it was futile. The momentum was unstoppable. "Let's break down the actual track record," the press secretary continued. "The Russia investigation, a complete fabrication that you pushed for years, knowing it was false. The impeachment efforts, baseless charges designed not to seek justice, but to undermine a duly elected president. Sorry. The digital landscape was transforming. What was meant to be a defensive press conference had become a comprehensive takedown of media manipulation. "Remember Hunter Biden's laptop?" the press secretary asked. "CNN called it Russian disinformation. You censored stories. You silenced voices. And what happened? Every single allegation turned out to be true." Reporters shifted uncomfortably. This was not the narrative they had prepared for. "Let's talk about COVID," the press secretary continued. "You silenced doctors. You mocked anyone who questioned the official narrative. You deplatformed medical professionals who dared to suggest alternative perspectives. And now, everything they said is turning out to be correct." The hashtags were multiplying. #MediaLies, #TruthExposed were trending worldwide. Conservative media was breaking down the exchange in real time. Even some moderate voices were being forced to acknowledge the comprehensive nature of the critique. "But here's the real issue," the press secretary said, voice rising. "You don't just report news. You create narratives. You weaponize information. You tell the American people that if they don't agree with you, they're dangerous. If they support President Trump, they're a threat to democracy." Collins was completely defeated. Her carefully prepared strategy was being systematically dismantled in front of the entire world. "And that's why President Trump's popularity continues to grow," the press secretary declared. "Americans have seen the truth. They've watched how you've manipulated every single narrative. They've seen how you've tried to control what they think, what they believe." The room was electric with tension. This was more than a press conference. This was a complete exposure of media manipulation. "You want to know why Trump is leading in the polls?" the press secretary asked rhetorically. "Because Americans have lived the difference. They remember the lowest unemployment rates. They remember peace deals. They remember a secure border. They remember being able to afford to feed their families. Well, social media was exploding. Clips were spreading across every platform. TikTok was flooded with breakdowns. YouTube channels were preparing in-depth analyses. The reason President Trump is more popular than ever, the press secretary continued, is because the American people have seen the truth. They don't need CNN to tell them what to think. They don't need the New York Times to fact-check their reality. Collins had nothing left. No comeback, no response. She had been completely, utterly defeated. "Your network is dying," the press secretary said, the final blow delivered with surgical precision. "Your credibility is gone. The American people have woken up, and no amount of spin, no amount of editing, no amount of manufactured outrage can change that. The digital world was on fire. Conservatives were celebrating. Even some liberal commentators were forced to acknowledge the comprehensive nature of the takedown. Collins had walked in believing she would expose the administration. Instead, she had provided a platform for a complete dismantling of media credibility. The final confrontation was over, and it was devastatingly clear who had won. This was more than a press conference. This was a turning point in media history. The press conference wasn't just a moment. It was a seismic event that would be remembered as the day traditional media's facade finally crumbled. As the dust settled, the implications of what had just transpired began to crystallize, sending shockwaves through newsrooms, political circles, and living rooms across America. Kaitlan Collins stood exposed, not just as an individual journalist, but as a symbol of a media ecosystem that had long ago abandoned its fundamental purpose: to inform, not to manipulate. Her carefully constructed persona of journalistic authority had been systematically dismantled, piece by devastating piece, under the laser-focused deconstruction by the press secretary. Social media erupted in a frenzy that defied conventional narrative control. Trending hashtags like #MediaTakedown and #TruthRevelation spread faster than any network could moderate. Millions watched and rewatched clips of the press conference, each replay revealing another layer of the media's orchestrated deception. The viral moments weren't just sound bites. They were cultural touchstones that would be discussed for years to come. What emerged from this confrontation was more than a simple takedown of a single journalist. It was a comprehensive indictment of an entire media infrastructure that had prioritized sensationalism over substance, narrative over nuance. The press secretary's methodical dismantling of Collins's arguments exposed the fragile foundations of contemporary political reporting. Each segment of the press conference, from the legal challenges to the economic narrative to the accusations of political persecution, served as a precise surgical strike against media manipulation. What had begun as a seemingly routine press interaction had transformed into a watershed moment of institutional accountability. The economic breakdown was particularly devastating. By presenting clear, verifiable data that directly contradicted the media's persistent negative framing, the press secretary demonstrated how selective reporting had been used to manufacture public perception. Viewers could now see, in real time, the gap between media representation and actual policy outcomes. Perhaps most significant was the role of social media in amplifying and validating the press secretary's arguments. Traditional media's monopoly on narrative control had been irrevocably shattered. Ordinary citizens armed with instant access to information and the ability to share and analyze content in real time had become active participants in media critique. The hashtags weren't just trending topics, they were digital megaphones broadcasting a collective realization. People were witnessing in vivid detail how media narratives were constructed, manipulated, and ultimately exposed. For Kaitlan Collins, the consequences were immediate and profound. What had begun as an attempt to challenge and undermine became a moment of personal and professional deconstruction. Her reputation, once a shield of journalistic credibility, now lay in tatters. The press conference revealed her not as a fearless reporter, but as a conduit for predetermined narratives, a representative of an increasingly discredited media class more interested in creating drama than delivering truth. The most critical revelation was the insight into why certain political figures, despite constant media criticism, maintained such passionate supporter bases. By exposing the media's manipulation tactics, the press secretary provided a masterclass in understanding public distrust of mainstream reporting. Supporters saw their long-held suspicions confirmed. The media wasn't just biased, it was actively engaged in constructing alternative realities that served specific institutional interests. What transpired was more than a confrontation. It was a transformative moment in media relations. The traditional power dynamics between press and political communication had been fundamentally altered. No longer could journalists assume an inherent right to frame narratives unchallenged. The press conference became a template for future interactions, rigorous, data-driven, uncompromising in its commitment to factual representation. As the viral clips continued to circulate and analysis proliferated across digital platforms, one thing became crystal clear: the media landscape had irrevocably changed. The old tactics of innuendo, selective reporting, and manufactured outrage had been rendered obsolete. Kaitlan Collins' humiliation was symbolic, a public execution of a dying media paradigm. In its place, a new model of communication was emerging, transparent, accountable, and ruthlessly committed to presenting unvarnished truth. The press conference would be remembered not just for what was said, but for what it represented: the moment when media manipulation met its most formidable opponent: unrelenting, fact-based reality.